Hi, everyone. I'm Simon Gatto, Chief Operations Officer at Comalatech, and I'm really hoping you guys are having a great time at another one of Meta-Inf's Atlassian Day events. We were super honored to be invited back to join them as a sponsor, and I was personally really happy that they decided to do the event again virtually this year. It's been a challenging year, to say the least. So anyone that's been able to find a way to get people together, to share content, to share ideas, I think it's just fantastic. I think it's something that people really needed. So I'm glad to see a number of the partners in the Atlassian ecosystem have kind of put on some of these events. And so we were super happy to be here. Obviously, I'm really looking forward to seeing you all in person. Hopefully next year, we can shake hands and have a drink and see each other in person. So we're looking forward to that. For my talk today, anyone who's already using Confluence will probably appreciate this if you're using it to create documentation or manuals. I'm going to be talking about some of the ways that you can share your content outside of your Confluence instance or outside of Confluence itself. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to flip over, I'm going to turn my video off. And it's a bit distracting. I'm going to flip over to my presentation. So let me just switch over and we'll get started. So better ways to share your content outside of Confluence. And one of the things when we talk about sharing content, another term we use kind of interchangeably now, is the concept of publishing as well. So sharing and publishing content. What we've seen over the last few years is it's really transformed companies who are using Confluence for documentation. It's gone from just using it from simple wiki stuff, internal simple pages, to full proper corporate documentation, so whether that's policies or customer manuals, things like that. So people have really started using it more in new and different ways than they were using in years past. And now that they're actually creating all of this great content, they've come to a point also where they realize, well, now what do we do with this excellent content that we've designed? How do we get that out to the people that we want to see it? So a couple of things to point out here. Things that we love about Confluence. It's an excellent tool for creating your content, for collaborating internally, getting comments. You can have multiple people working on documents to really produce something that is a really excellent piece of work. It makes the creation process really simple. So your teams who are building your documentation really can just spend time coming up with great content, not fussing around with sort of cumbersome word processing tools. So we're actually seeing Confluence replacing some of those old standards like Word and things like that, because it has the functionality now to really create this impactful documentation. A lot of companies are doing that. Something that's not always as easy then, once you've actually finished with that documentation, is figuring out how to make sure that the documentation you've created gets into the hands of the right people. So sharing that out, publishing it, particularly if those people are not even in your Confluence instance, so they're not interacting with it, they might be external to the company. So that's a challenge that we see a lot, and that's really what the focus of this talk is going to be about. So types of sharing, what are we actually talking about? What are the use cases that we see? So obviously Comalatech, as one of Atlassian's gold marketplace vendors, we like to think that we specialize in document management. So we deal almost exclusively with people trying to figure out better ways of managing their documentation. So some of the things that we see on a regular basis, sharing product manuals and documentation with your customers. They're outside your network, they're not on your Confluence, but you need to make sure that the product manuals and FAQs and everything that you're developing for your product actually can get to your customers. They can look it up, they can get the help they need. So that's a very sort of classic use case that we see. Sending document sets to external stakeholders. So when we talk about document sets, and then we see their ISO auditors. So document sets tend to be sort of very formal. They're locked down documentation that you need to give often for auditing reasons. So we have a lot of customers that, excuse me, are FDA, ISO, working under some kind of compliance restrictions. And so of course, once a year, auditors show up and they have to be able to provide them with very detailed audit documentation. So that's something, again, these are external people, they don't work for the company. So you have to have some way that you can get them that information, get them the reports that they need. Distributing new policies amongst your team members. So this is sounds a little bit more internal, but often the team members in a company are not using Confluence. They're not designing documents. They're not in managing pages and building things out. They just need to be able to read perhaps new corporate policies that are being released. So HR policies, different types of policies for the department that you work in, My wife's a nurse, so at the hospital she works at, they're always updating the policies for how certain drugs are administered and different procedures that they have to follow. So these are internal people, but not on Confluence, and they need to be able to get these policies, make sure they're reading, keeping up to date on what's going on and how to do things, how things are supposed to work within the company. And lastly, they're sharing individual pages with external collaborators. So kind of sounds like number 2, but this is more for, you might work with, and it's actually very common, like an external contractor, could be a marketing firm, maybe a legal company that you're having sort of read over documentation that you're creating. Again, they don't work for you, but you need to be able to share content you're building, either get feedback from them and things like that. So being able to just kind of easily share with these folks that are, again, not in your network, not in your Confluence, but they still need to be able to read and look over the stuff that you're building. So these are probably the 4 most common ones that we come across when it comes to sharing documentation or publishing as well. So of course, there are some options natively in Confluence that are available. So you don't need anything else. It's built into Confluence. And it seems really obvious, but a lot of times we've actually found that a lot of our prospects and customers tend to overlook some of these options, or they haven't fully explored how they can use them. Because there are some options that are built in that work in a lot of cases for many use cases. So some of those options, obviously, export to PDF. This is probably the classic, the old standby, we call it. So PDF still tends to be the most generally widely accepted format for getting documents to people. It's restricted or moderately restricted. It can't be modified too easily. It is fairly quick and easy within Confluence to export a page to a PDF file. It's built right in, so it's not hard to do it. Pretty straightforward. But again, anyone that's used this before probably realized that the export functionality is pretty limited. The formatting will often get lost. You may have built some really cool looking page. Confluence gives you some really neat tools for just building out really awesome looking pages. Often that doesn't translate as well to PDF. If you've got macros in there, you might have problems capturing those macros and having them land on the PDF properly. Also getting them out to people. So saving PDFs, emailing things out can get a little cumbersome and awkward to just make sure you're able to distribute these PDFs easily. One thing that I would point out though, we work quite extensively with our good friends over at K15T, and they produce an app called Scroll PDF Exporter. We recommend this a lot to our customers because in some cases, PDF is the only way to go. They have to provide a PDF to somebody, an auditor for something that they're working on. And the PDF exporting app gives you some really nice, rich PDF export options that will help you keep that nice formatting, macros, things like that. So it is an option. And if you want to stick with just PDF, the PDF exporter does really give you some nice control over that. And like I said, we have a lot of customers that are using that when PDF really is the only option that they have for sharing their content. Anonymous access is another one. Obviously, this is kind of the original wiki use case. We want to, information wants to be free. We want to allow we just want to open up our docs and people can comment and give them the thumbs up and like them. And it's great. And everyone can get in there and collaborate on stuff. And that's really what a wiki was all about, except when you start exposing this out to a large audience, people who you don't know are connecting to it and using it, it starts to become a little bit of a concern, particularly for security guys. So again, it does help reach sort of a large audience. They don't need logins. They can just connect to it. This is probably, a lot of people, even us, use this for their product documentation. We have a wiki, so we're using this in a version of this on ours. And it's still very common. But again, there are some risks, particularly now. Not that people weren't security conscious before, but it's definitely become, particularly moving into cloud, and that security is really top of mind for a lot of people, and just kind of opening up your documentation to anonymous people for casual viewing, not always the best option, and the IT folks are not always happy with that either. So anonymous access can be a little bit problematic for that. Something that I wanted to bring up on this presentation, because we thought we would be remiss if we didn't mention it, was something that was actually announced in the Atlassian community late last year, something that Atlassian is calling external share. This is specific to cloud. So for anyone that's using cloud or thinking about moving to cloud, this is an option that's going to become available. It's only going to become available, as far as we know, in the premium version of Confluence. So if you have the standard one, I don't think you get this, but this is essentially going to create a way to share a static link with somebody that's external to your organization to be able to view the current version of a page. So when we're talking about that sharing with external contractors, this seems like it's going to be a really cool way to do that. We actually have a server app. Some of you guys who might know us may have actually seen it, called Share It. It's only for server, but it essentially is the same idea where you can share a static link to a page in your Confluence instance. Anyone with that link can view the current version of that page. But again, Atlassian decided to put it into cloud, which we think makes tons of sense for this specific reason. Not available yet. They said that it's going to be released probably within the next quarter, so keep an eye out for that. But we think this is going to be a really cool way when you do have to share specific pages out to people that are outside of your organization. So again, just sort of recapping some of the challenges of using these built-in sort of native options that Confluence does provide. So PDF formatting, you have issues, your formatting might get lost, macros might get updated or changed, they might not carry across so well. Opening up documentation for anonymous to everybody. You could be exposing things that you may not want to have exposed yet, or versions of the documentation that might not be quite ready, or a certain page within your documentation somewhere might get lost and it's not quite been updated to the proper versions. As I mentioned before, friction between being able to share openly and your security folks. They might have issues with just opening a space or an instance up to everybody to just access it. So that's another issue that you might come across. Getting the right people to read your content. I'm going to touch on this one a little bit later as well, but you've created this great documentation, you figured out the best way that you can to actually share that out with people, but how do you make sure that the people that need to be reading this stuff are actually getting it? So I'm going to provide some suggestions for that later as well. And the last one, which continues to be a big deciding factor we find in a lot of cases, is just licensing limitations. You want to open something up, even anonymous access, they're going to be using up licenses. This becomes even more important or more of a crucial issue on the cloud side, where you're actually paying per seat. So in the server data center world, where you were buying a chunk of licenses, typically you didn't have a bunch of licenses to spare, obviously, but with cloud, you're actually paying per seat. So you may not necessarily want just people sort of casually viewing your stuff that don't really need to be in there using up a license. So that's another problem that people often come across. So one of the other great reasons about using Confluence is that you also have access to this fantastic marketplace with apps that are going to help you make working with the tool even better. Of course, this is where we come in as a marketplace vendor. This is really where we specialize. So we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at some of the apps that are available in the marketplace that specifically sort of focus on the concept of publishing content. So this sharing or publishing that I've been talking about. So the first one, near and dear to us, of course, and this is an app that Comalatech produces. Some of you guys might be familiar with it, but Kamala Publishing. So the Kamala Publishing app really allows you to sort of extend your content creation or publishing essentially to be able to create and separate your content between different spaces. So we had a lot of customers that said, hey, we really need to have a place to work on our documentation, but we don't want users or people accessing it from the same space, because we could still be working on it and not be ready yet. So what can we do about that? So publishing really allows you to create content in one sort of draft space and then actually publish that to a separate target space. And this target space, of course, that you're publishing to, all of a sudden now you have a completely different set of restrictions that you can apply to that space. You can lock it right down to read-only access. You can apply anonymous access just to that one space. But really it just allows you to not have to worry about all of your sort of in the work stuff getting mixed in with stuff that people might be accessing it. This way you've actually got two different completely separate spaces. You can make sure that you're keeping your draft stuff, the stuff that you're working on, completely separate from that other space where users or customers are actually accessing the documentation. And publishing is available for data center, server, and also we released it for cloud at the end of last year as well. So it's available across all of the different hosting platforms. And a slight variation to our publishing app, remote publishing. It sounds very similar, but we actually did have some customers that wanted to go even beyond just separating their content from one space to another, but they actually wanted to completely separate their content in different instances of Confluence. So this is often customers, or sorry, clients we have that have a separate instance of Confluence sitting in a DMZ. Outside their central network, where customers might be coming in to access content. So what the remote publishing app allows you to do, again, same idea, you have a core internal server where you're designing and working on your documentation, but once you publish that, it does actually get pushed to a completely separate Confluence instance. So works really well. Obviously, a lot of advantages security-wise, completely different instances. But one thing I would point out here is the remote publishing does require our document management app to use. So anyone that hasn't seen it, if you check in the marketplace, one of the other tools we create and produce is our Kamala document management, which allows you to implement a approval process for your documents. And as part of that approval process, you can then, once a page goes through those necessary approval steps, it can get published out to your remote instance of Confluence. So again, kind of a different twist on the publishing concept. It automates that publishing. So once again, it goes through that approval process. It will automatically push your pages over to your separate Confluence instance. And again, the biggest advantage here is security. You don't have to have anybody accessing your core sort of internal Confluence instance. It can all be pushed to that separate instance, and that's the only place your external people need to go to get that documentation. And the last one here that we also wanted to point out again, because this is a use case that a lot of our customers have, and there's a really great tool from, again, the folks at K15T, is our scroll viewport option. And this is really a great tool, specifically if you're looking at wanting to publish a help center. They have some built-in templates which essentially allow you to publish your Confluence content into a really easy to navigate help center using static HTML pages. So essentially you can set up a custom URL potentially for your product documentation, and then anything that you're creating in Confluence can be published out to these static HTML pages for your customers. So again, it's allowing them to access this content without having to give them access to your internal Confluence content. And anytime you update the Confluence pages, of course, you can then push that stuff out. So as you're updating your product documentation, you can automatically push that out to your help center as well. So again, this is just another great way of being able to publish or share help center content, product content with customers, separated from your core Confluence stuff. So again, that's the K15T scroll viewport app, also available in the marketplace, and you can get it for server and data center, and there's also a cloud version as well. So another twist we've been seeing the last probably year or two, well, at least probably 2 years, and I mentioned this just briefly before, is not just creating content and then publishing or sharing that content, but sort of the third piece that's come up now is like, well, we've spent all this time building this content and we figured out a really slick way of being able to share this content, whether we're publishing it to a different space or maybe a different instance or a help center that we've set up. But now what do we do as far as wanting to make sure that people are actually reading the content that we have? So this is sort of like, well, yeah, how do we validate, or how do we justify that people are actually reading it? Or are these policies that we need to make sure, hey, these policies have to be read? This is mandatory. Your employees need to read this stuff. It's important. If we're talking about hospital policies, you need to make sure that the nurses are reading these new updates because they're probably really important for them to be aware of. So something that we've recently released is our Kamala reconfirmations app. So again, this is something that you can use along with our document management tool on server and data center. And it's also available as a standalone app for cloud. But essentially what this is going to allow you to do is actually assign users that need to read pages. So any of the users that you have, again, this is the primary use case for this one that we've seen really is around internal policies, HR policies, things like that, where you're producing documentation. It might be for onboarding. All your new employees need to read this. So basically what you can do is create the list of people who have to acknowledge that they read this page. They get notified, hey, there's a page here, you need to go in and read it. and then they actually go in and say, yes, I confirm that I've read it, and it creates a paper trail. So you're actually able to assign people to read pages, keep track of who's actually read it and confirmed, yes, I read this page. And then of course you can add new readers if necessary. So if you do have a new person, maybe this is your HR policy handbook, somebody new starts with the company, they get assigned to the page, they need to go in and make sure that they've read and confirm they've read all of these pages. So reconfirmations, again, this is probably our newest addition to the tools that we have, but we realized, this is becoming more and more of a request or a demand for our customers, because like I said, they've spent a lot of time developing great content, making sure that it's available to people who need to read it. So now they want to make sure, yes, that person has actually read it, and we have a record that they've actually confirmed that they've read it. So definitely worth checking out. And again, it sort of rounds out that creation, publishing, reconfirmation process that we're seeing is becoming more common with the people that we're working with. All right, so that brings us to the end of my presentation around sharing your Confluence content outside of Confluence. Hopefully this was insightful for you guys, provided you guys with a bit of information. Some of it may have been a little bit of a refresher or giving you some ideas. Maybe you want to go back into your Confluence instance and try playing around with some of the options that are there. Or you might want to go to the marketplace and have a look at some of the apps that we looked at today. Obviously, they're all available to try for free. So you might have some use cases in your own organization that you're like, man, I really love to be able to publish this documentation, but we were worried about making sure that it was secure, making worried that the right people were going to be reading it. So this might give you some ideas on some tools that you could implement to be able to actually now take your documentation to the next level. Make sure that you'll be able to actually not just create great documentation, but share it out and publish it with the people that need to read it. All right, so we're going to wrap it up here, but we're going to open it up for some questions. So I'm going to turn off my sharing and hand it back over to the great folks at Meta-Inf, and we'll have a round of Q&A. All right, thanks everybody.